She had everything: the billion-dollar empire, the corner office on the 42nd floor, and the power to destroy anyone who stood in her way. He walked in, wearing a 10-year-old suit and shoes that had seen better days. She laughed at him in front of everyone. She called him poor. She called him a nobody. She never imagined he was holding the one thing that could take everything from her. What happens when the man a billionaire humiliated comes back not to beg, but to take her chair? Stay with me. This story will change how you see power forever. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we post stories like this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Let's get into it. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, and the first thing Graham Hale noticed was the carpet. It was thick, the kind of thick that costs more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. Navy blue, perfectly clean, and it swallowed the sound of his footsteps completely, which was good because his shoes were not the kind of shoes that belonged on carpet like this, and he already knew it. He paused for a half second just inside the elevator, adjusting the strap of his briefcase. The leather was cracked along the left corner, where he dropped it on a concrete driveway 3 winters ago and never got around to fixing it. He had meant to. He just kept not getting to it. The reception area of North Star Industrial Group's headquarters looked exactly the way it looked in every magazine spread he'd seen over the last decade. Floor-to-ceiling windows, abstract sculpture in brushed steel. A young woman behind a desk that probably cost $12,000, wearing a headset and an expression that had been trained to communicate warmth without ever actually feeling it. She looked up at him. He watched her eyes do the thing eyes do, the fast scan. Shoes, suit, briefcase, back up to the face. A flicker of something she tried to hide. "Can I help you?" she said, perfectly polite. "Graham Hale," he said. "I have a 9 o'clock with the board." She typed something, looked at her screen, typed again. Her expression shifted barely, but he caught it. A tiny recalibration. Whatever name she'd just confirmed was not the name that went with the suit standing in front of her. "Course," she said, more carefully this time. "I'll let them know you're here. Can I get you anything while you wait? Water, coffee?" "I'm fine," Graham said. "Thank you." He took a seat in one of the chairs along the far wall. The couch. The chair. He'd learned a long time ago that you don't sink into a couch when you need to get up fast. He set the briefcase across his knees, rested his hands on top of it, and looked out the windows at the city 42 floors below. It was a clear morning, the kind of clear that only comes in early October, when the humidity finally breaks and the air has some bite to it. From up here, you could see the river, you could see the bridges. You could see thousands of people moving through the streets below, and not one of them knew what was about to happen in this building. Graham was 32 years old. He looked older than that, if he was honest. In a bad way, exactly, just in the way that men look older when they've carried things. There were lines around his eyes that shouldn't be there yet. His hair had gone slightly gray at the temples, somewhere between his wife's second round of chemo and her third. He hadn't noticed at the time. Lily had pointed it out one morning at breakfast, matter-of-factly, the way 16-year-olds deliver information without understanding the weight of it. "You're getting gray hair. I know. You should dye it. I'll think about it." He hadn't thought about it. He sat in the chair on the 42nd floor of North Star Industrial Group's headquarters, with his cracked briefcase and his old shoes and his temples going gray. And he breathed. Slow. Even. The way Dr. Marsh had taught him years ago when the panic attacks were bad, right after the funeral, right after he'd had to explain to Lily that her mother wasn't coming home from the hospital, right after he'd sat in the parking lot of a Walgreens at 2 in the morning because he couldn't figure out how to go back to an apartment that felt like a wound. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. He was not panicking now. He just needed the muscle memory. The elevator opened again behind him, and the sound of voices spilled into the reception area, sharp, confident, the kind of voices that belonged on carpet like this. Graham didn't turn around immediately. He listened. Quarterly projections are still salvageable if we... I don't need salvageable. I need good. Get me good. He knew that voice. He would have known it anywhere, actually. 8 years was a long time, but some voices don't change. They just get sharper. He turned. Vanessa Sterling was 30 years old. And look, she looked exactly like her profile piece ever written about her. Not because those pieces were particularly accurate, because Vanessa had spent years making sure her public image and her actual presence were indistinguishable. She was tall, dressed in charcoal gray, her hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless, but almost certainly wasn't. She was beautiful in the way that certain objects are beautiful, precisely engineered, no wasted lines. She was walking toward the conference room hallway with two men at her shoulders. The one on her left pale, expensive glasses, a posture like a man who'd never stood in a line in his life. That was Miles Corbett, her attorney. Graham recognized him from the company website. The one on her right was heavier, florid-faced, carrying a tablet like a shield. That would be Derek Shaw, the CFO. Vanessa hadn't seen Graham yet. She turned to say something to Derek, and then she glanced across the reception area, and she stopped. It was the briefest stop, a half-beat, no more. But Graham saw it. He saw the moment she placed him. He watched the recognition move across her face, and then he watched something else move across it. Something he didn't have a clean word for. Not quite contempt, quite satisfaction. Something more complicated than both of those things, something that had been sitting in storage for 8 years and had just been taken down off the shelf. She changed course. She walked across the reception area toward him, and Miles and Derek followed automatically, because that was what they did. Graham stood. He did it slowly, without hurrying, and he was acutely aware of how he looked in that moment. The suit, the shoes, the briefcase with the cracked corner. He was aware of all of it the way you're aware of a splinter present, uncomfortable, but not disabling. Vanessa stopped a few feet from him. She looked him over the same way the receptionist had, but she didn't try to hide it. "Graham Hale," she said. "Vanessa." She tilted her head, almost imperceptibly. "It's been a while." 8 years, he said. "Has it?" It wasn't a question. She let her gaze travel down to his shoes and back up again, and when her eyes reached his face, there was something in them that might have been pity if it weren't so deliberate. She paused, just long enough tired. "It's a Monday." A small, precise smile. "What are you doing here, Graham?" "I have a meeting." "A meeting." She repeated it as though he'd said something gently absurd. She turned to Miles briefly, then back. "With whom?" "Bored." Something shifted behind her eyes. Just slightly. "The board doesn't have any—" "Vanessa!" The voice came from down the hallway, and everyone turned. Margaret Ellison was 61 years old, short, and moved like someone who had long ago stopped caring what rooms looked like when she walked into them. She was the board chair of North Star Industrial Group, and she had the kind of authority that doesn't announce itself, because it doesn't have to. "Mr. Hale," she said, walking toward them. "Good. You're on time." She looked at Vanessa with an expression that was professionally neutral and therefore deeply communicative. "Vanessa, we're ready for you in the main conference room. Mr. Hale will be joining us." Vanessa's voice was very controlled. "I wasn't aware that—" "No," Margaret said, simply. "You weren't." The main conference room had a table that seated 24. 8 of those seats were occupied 6 board members, Margaret at the head, and now Graham, who took the chair he was directed to at the far end. Vanessa sat in the center of the long side, between Miles and Derek, and she folded her hands on the table in front of her and waited with the patience of someone who was not feeling patient. Graham set his briefcase down beside his chair. He did not open it. Margaret didn't waste time. "Vanessa, you've been told that the board has initiated a financial review. What you haven't been told is the scope and nature of that review, or who we've engaged to conduct it." She paused. 3 weeks ago, the board commissioned independent assessment of North Star's financial health and operational integrity. That assessment is being led by Mr. Hale. Silence. The good kind of silence, the kind with texture. Vanessa looked at Graham. Her expression had not changed in any way that most people in the room would have been able to identify. But Graham, who had spent 8 years thinking about Vanessa Sterling more than he would ever admit to anyone, could see that she was working. She started. Of our most recent quarterly reports, our liability disclosures, and certain operational figures that have been presented to us over the past 18 months. We have 48 hours. Mr. Hale has full access to all facilities, personnel, and records. She looked around the table. Full access. Without exception. Is that understood? A few board members nodded. Derek Shaw was studying his tablet screen with enormous intensity. I'd like to understand, Vanessa said, carefully. On what basis Mr. Hale was selected for this role? He hasn't been affiliated with North in 8 years. And his departure from the company was... His departure was documented, Graham said. Everyone looked at him. He'd kept his voice mild, not aggressive, just present. It was, Vanessa agreed, and the documentation wasn't flattering. Graham said it wasn't, which is interesting, because I have the original. He placed his hand on the briefcase, the version that existed before it was rewritten. Silence. Different texture. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. I think, Miles said, his voice oiled, professional, that we should be careful about making unsupported accusations in a room full of. I'm not making an accusation, Graham said. I'm just noting that I have documentation. We don't have to deal with it now. We can deal with it as part of the review. He looked at Margaret. If that's acceptable. Entirely acceptable, Margaret said. After the meeting broke, after the board members filed out, and the room emptied in that particular way, rooms empty when something significant has just happened. Vanessa didn't leave immediately. Graham was gathering his notepad from the table when he heard her heels on the floor. He didn't look up. You think this is a victory, she said. I think it's a Tuesday, he said. She stopped on the other side of the table. At this distance, without the full boardroom as witness, there was something different about her. Softer, exactly. More honest. You've been carrying that story for 8 years, she said. I have. He looked up then, haven't you? She didn't answer that. I'm going to be honest with you, she said, and the formality in her voice had dropped a register. I don't know what you think you're going to find in 48 hours, but North Star is a multi-billion-dollar operation. Yet a single father with a consulting business that doesn't have a website. The gap between what you understand and what actually runs this company is significant, Graham said. I know, so why are you here? He picked up his briefcase. The cracked corner caught a flash of light. Because someone has to be, he said, and I know where to look. He walked toward the door. Graham. Her voice stopped him, and there was something in it he hadn't expected. Anger. Something that sat underneath anger. Your wife. I heard I'm sorry. About what happened. He turned back slightly. Fully. Thank you, he said, and he left. The factory was an hour and 40 minutes from the city, and Graham drove himself. He'd been offered a car and driver standard treatment for someone in his current role, technically, but he'd declined. He needed the drive. He needed the hour and 40 minutes of highway to stop performing. And just think, his phone rang 40 minutes out. He put it through the car's speakers. Hey, Dad. Hey, Lilybird. How'd the meeting go? Still in progress. That means it went weird. He almost smiled. It went fine. How are you? Did you eat something before school? A pause. I had a granola bar. Lily, it was a big granola bar. He stopped himself. She was 16, picking this fight at 40 minutes outside. The city wasn't the battle. There's stuff in the freezer. Eat something real tonight, okay? I don't know what time I'll be back. A pause. Dad? Yeah, you're going to be okay today, right? He thought about that, about what she meant by it, and the fact that she was 16 years old and already knew how to question sideways, the way you do when the direct version is too much. He said, I'm to be fine. Okay, love you. Love you too. Go learn something. She made the sound she made that was not quite a laugh and hung up. He drove the rest of the way with the radio off. The factory was called North Star Production Site 7, and it was enormous. 430,000 square feet, running 2 shifts a day, 6 days a week. 312 workers on the floor. It built precision components for heavy industrial equipment, the kind of components that cost $2 to get wrong, and $12 million in liability when you did. The plant manager was a man named Tom Greer, early 50s, thick across the shoulders, the permanently tired look of someone who'd been absorbing pressure from both directions for years. He met Graham at the gate with the expression of a man who wasn't sure whether the person in front of him was friend or threat. Mr. Hale, said Tom. Graham shook his hand. I appreciate you making time. I was told I didn't have a choice. Graham said pleasantly. But I meant it anyway. They walked the floor. Graham had requested that no presentations be prepared. Slides, no data packets, no carefully assembled narratives about efficiency and throughput. He wanted to walk the floor and look at the floor, and that was what he did. Tom followed, initially trying to narrate. This line runs at 92% efficiency. This conveyor system was upgraded last year. These stations are running the new calibration protocol, and Graham let him talk, nodding occasionally, but his eyes were elsewhere. They were on the machines, on the operators, on the subtle language of a working factory floor, which, if you knew how to read it, told you far more than any presentation ever could. He saw it within the first 20 minutes. Line 4. It was running. The conveyor was moving, components were cycling through, workers were at their stations. It looked operational. But the output counter on the far end hadn't moved in the time Graham had been watching it. The belt was moving, but nothing was coming through. He stopped walking. "Tom," he said quietly, "what's line 4 producing today?" Tom glanced at his clipboard. "Should be running batch 7 of the Hansen order. 1,800 units by end of shift. How many has it produced so far today?" Tom looked at the floor. "I'd have to check the system. I can see the output counter from here," Graham said. "It says 43. Tom said nothing. "How long has line 4 been producing 43 units a day?" A pause. A long one. Mr. Hale. Tom Graham turned to face him, aggressively, just directly. "I'm not here to get you in trouble. I'm here because the board needs to know what's actually happening in this building. And I think you already know what's actually happening." Tom Greer looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up, and the exhaustion in his face deepened by several years in the space of one breath. "Line 4's been down for 11 weeks, he said. "Low enough that nearby workers couldn't hear. The main drive assembly failed. Parts are on back order. We've had 4 replacement units shipped, and 3 of them failed within 48 hours. But the system shows it as operational." Tom didn't answer. Which was an answer. "Who told you to report it as operational?" Tom looked away. "Derek Shaw," Graham said. Still silence. Which was also an answer. Graham made a note. Then he kept walking. The inventory room was on the building's north end, climate-controlled, locked. Graham stood in it for 40 minutes with the inventory manager, a slight woman named Patricia who smelled like cigarettes smoke and kept her hair in a bun so tight it looked painful going through paper records versus digital records. Patricia had not been told to alter anything. She said so 3 times unprompted, which told Graham she was telling the truth the first time and that she was frightened. The discrepancies were not subtle once you looked for them. 17,000 units of component 7 Bravo listed in the digital system. Actual physical count, 4,211. "When was the last physical count?" Graham asked. "We do them quarterly," Patricia said. "Last one was, she checked her logs 14 months ago. The system shows one 3 months ago. There wasn't one." Her voice was very flat. "I run the counts. There wasn't one." Graham closed his notebook. He stood in the inventory room and thought about what it takes to falsify 14 months of physical inventory. The deliberateness of it, the sustained effort, the number of people who had to look at numbers and decide over and over to write down something different from what they saw. He thought about the workers on the floor, 312 of them, going to work every morning, running broken equipment, keeping their mouths shut because rent was due, because health insurance came from this job, because the economy was not kind to people who made trouble. He thought about Tom Greer absorbing the pressure from both directions for however many years this had been building, doing the math every morning between what was true and what he was allowed to say. He thought about Lily, home alone, eating a granola bar for breakfast. He picked up his notebook. "Patricia," he said, "I'm going to need copies of every physical inventory record going back 24 months. Paper copies, not from the system, from your files. The ones you keep in the gray cabinets in the back." She stared at him. "How did you know about the gray cabinets?" "Because you're good at your job," he said. "And people who are good at their job keep a separate record. Just in case." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she went to the gray cabinets. Yes, he'd intervened. He found the model at 9:47 that evening, working through the company's internal documents in the small conference room they'd given him on the 3rd floor of the administrative building. He wasn't looking for it specifically. He was cross-referencing operational restructuring documents from 6 years ago, trying to understand when the financial manipulation had begun, when he found a folder labeled Sterling Recovery Framework in the archived files. He opened it. The document inside was dated 6 years ago. 43 pages, dense with operational analysis and strategic recovery modeling. Vanessa had presented it at an industry conference 4 years back, and it had made her famous a comprehensive framework for turning around failing manufacturing operations that had since been implemented at 17 companies and taught in 3 business schools. Graham read the introduction, then the methodology section, then the financial modeling approach. He set the papers down very carefully on the table. He got up, walked to the window, stood there for a moment looking out at the parking lot, which was empty at this hour except for 2 security vehicles making their rounds. He sat back down and kept reading. Because what he was holding in his hands, what he was celebrating Vanessa Sterling's most celebrated intellectual achievement, was a framework he had built himself, approximately, not in broad strokes, in specific, granular, reproducible detail, down to the terminology, the sequencing, the diagnostic criteria. He had written the original in the 3rd year of his marriage, the 1st year of Lily's life, when North Star had still employed him, and he'd been tasked with developing a recovery protocol for a failing subsidiary. He'd spent 8 months on it. He'd written it on nights and weekends at the kitchen table, while his wife, still healthy then, still laughing, still complaining that his reading lamp was too bright, fell asleep on the couch. He had never published it. It had lived in North Star's internal servers, filed under his name, cited in an internal memo as Hale Recovery Framework 2018. Somewhere between his forced resignation and Vanessa Sterling's industry conference debut, his name had disappeared from it entirely. Graham Hale sat in the empty conference room at 9:47 in the evening, in his old suit, and cracked his briefcase and his shoes with scratches. And he held 43 pages of his own work with someone else's name on it. He should have felt something sharp. Anger, maybe. Vindication or grief. What he actually felt sitting there was tired. Defeated. Just tired. In the way you get tired when something that hurt you a long time ago finally shows you its whole shape. And the shape is exactly what you always suspected. And the confirmation doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes it real in a new and heavier way. He thought about Ellen, his wife, who had read a draft of that framework and told him it was the clearest thing he'd ever written, who had marked up 3 pages of it in red pen with questions and suggestions. Hind, whose handwriting was still somewhere in a box in the closet of their rented house because he had never been able to throw it away. She would have had something specific and direct to say about this moment. He could almost hear it. He took out his phone and typed a text to Lily, still working. Wait up. There's soup in the cabinet above the stove. 3 seconds later. Kay also, the neighbor's cat, is on the porch again. Leave it water, he typed back. I already did, she sent. Night, Dad, night, he typed. He put the phone down. He picked up his pen. And Graham Hale, the 32-year-old widowed single father with the old shoes and the battered briefcase in the kitchen table where he'd once written 43 pages that changed an industry, went back to work. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. He stretched out on the narrow couch in the 3rd floor conference room around 2 in the morning, using his jacket as a blanket, and he drifted in and out of something that resembled sleep the way a gas station sandwich resembles food. Technically present, not actually nourishing. By 5:30, he was sitting up again, tie loosened, collar open, working through the supplier payment records that Patricia had quietly slipped under the conference room door at 11 the previous night, along with its sticky note that said only, "The gray cabinets go back further than you asked. I thought you should know." The gray cabinets, it turned out, went back 4 years. 4 years of paper records that did not match what lived in North Star's digital system. 4 years of Patricia quietly keeping her own count, her own dates, her own numbers, not because she knew what she was documenting, but because she was the kind of person who kept records the way other people kept life insurance, just in case the day came when you needed them. Graham was beginning to understand that North Star's real story, the one underneath the one Vanessa had been telling, the world was held together largely by people like Patricia. Workers and middle managers who knew something was wrong, who couldn't articulate exactly what, who didn't have the language or the leverage to expose it, and who had compensated by quietly, silently keeping their own version of the truth. He made a note to remember that. At 6:15, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. "Lily, you're awake?" he said. "I have a 7 a.m. lab." Her voice had the texture of someone who had also not slept particularly well. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some." "Dad, I slept fine, Lily. You have that voice." "What voice? The one where you say you're fine and your voice does the opposite." A pause. "Are you eating?" He looked at the empty coffee cup from the vending machine down the hall. "I had something." "That means no. I'll get breakfast." "Do your lab. Learn something about cells. It's actually about chemical bonding." "Then learn about that," he softened his voice. "I'll call you tonight." "Okay." Quieter. "You're doing something important, aren't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Do it right," she said, and hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment after she was gone. 16 years old, and she'd already figured out how to send him off to battle. Whether to be proud of that or sad about it. Probably both. With Lily, it was usually both. He got up, straightened his tie as best he could without a mirror, picked up his notebook, and went back to work. Vanessa was in the building by 7:45. Graham knew this because he could feel it, which sounded like the kind of thing people said in movies and didn't mean in real life. But in this case was almost literally true. The administrative floor changed when Vanessa Sterling arrived. Voices dropped. Movements became more deliberate. People who had been walking normally began walking with purpose, because standing still when the CEO was present felt dangerous. He'd intervened. He was in the Keyboards room on the second floor when Miles Corbett appeared in the doorway at 8:05. Miles was the kind of attorney who wore his profession like armor. Everything about him was calculated: the watch, the pocket square, the way he stood in doorways as though he'd already measured them. He was 44 and had the particular brand of confidence that comes from spending 2 decades being paid to make problems disappear. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I trust you settled in adequately last night." "Fine, thanks." Miles stepped into the room, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the spread of documents on the table with the studied casualness of a man who absolutely wanted to know what was on that table. "Miss Sterling wanted me to check in this morning and see if there's anything you need. Full cooperation as promised." "I appreciate that." Graham didn't look up from the file he was reading. "Actually, I do need something. I need the original personnel files from 2016 through 2019. Physical files, not digital copies." A pause. "That should be straightforward enough," Miles says, in the tone of a man deciding how straightforward to make it. "I'll have someone pull them. I'd like to pull them myself. If someone can just point me to the archive room." Pause, slightly longer. "Of course," Miles said. "I'll arrange access." "Also," Graham said, finally looking up, "I need the original contract files for the Hansen account, the Meridian account, and the Calworth Group going back to 2020, the summary documents. The full contracts, amendments, and correspondence." Miles's expression didn't change. "That was," Graham noted, "actually impressive keeping your face that still, when 3 of your most problematic client relationships had just been named in sequence, required a certain kind of discipline." "I'll have those pulled as well," Miles said. "Great." Graham looked back at his file. "Thanks, Miles." Miles stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was natural. Then he left. Graham listened to his footsteps down the hallway, and about 30 seconds later heard the muffled sound of a phone call being placed from somewhere down the corridor. He did not smile, but it was a near thing. Vanessa found him at 10:30. Not by accident. Vanessa Sterling did not do things by accident. She appeared in the doorway of the conference room, where Graham had relocated larger table. Better light, dressed in deep blue today. Her expression composed into something that was professionally friendly and personally furious, which was a combination she had clearly practiced. She had a coffee. She hadn't brought one for him. "You made an impression on Tom Greer yesterday," she said, sitting down across from him without being invited. "Tom's a good man," Graham said. "He's been with the company for 14 years. He told me." Graham set down his pen. "He also told me that Line 4 has been down for 11 weeks and that he was directed to report it as operational." Vanessa's jaw shifted. almost imperceptibly. There's a reporting protocol for equipment downtime that goes through Derek's office. Sometimes there are delays between. The output counter said 43 units, Vanessa. Equipment failures are complicated. 11 weeks, Graham said. Reported as operational. For 11 weeks. How many other lines are we talking about? She looked at him. The professionally friendly layer was gone now, and what remained was just the fury cleaner, almost easier to deal with. You have no idea what it takes to run a company this size, she said. The complexity of what we're managing across 7 facilities, 32 product lines, 400 plus supplier relationships. You cannot walk in here with a notepad after 24 hours and think you understand what you're looking at. I've been here less than 24 hours, and I've found falsified production records, inventory discrepancies totaling about 12 million in misrepresented assets, and 3 supplier relationships where payment is between 60 and 90 days past due. He paused. What am I going to find when I've been here the full 48? The silence between them had weight. This company has 17,000 employees, Vanessa said, and her voice had shifted again, lower, more deliberate. 17,000 people who come to work every day because North Star exists. When you look at those numbers on your notepad, you're looking at a very complicated situation that has been managed imperfectly. Yes, under pressure. Yes, by people who are trying to hold something very large together. Burning it down doesn't help those 17,000 people. I'm not trying to burn it down, Graham said. Then what are you trying to do? Find out what's actually true. He met her eyes. And I think you know that's exactly what you should be afraid of. She stood up. I'm going to give you something, she said, and her voice was very controlled now, as a courtesy. As a professional courtesy between 2 people who both understand what's actually at stake here. She set her coffee down on the table. My family built this company over 40 years. My father gave 30 of those years to North Star. I grew up in this building, and yes, I have made decisions under pressure that in hindsight could have been handled differently. But the idea that Graham Hale, who hasn't been part of this industry for 8 years, who runs a one-man consulting operation out of a rented office, is qualified to make judgments about the management of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. I'm not making judgments, Graham said. I'm reading records. The same records that your falsified personnel file came from? He held her gaze. That's an interesting thing to bring up. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite what he expected. He expected calculation. What he actually saw was something that looked like a person who just heard themselves say a thing they hadn't meant to say out loud. She picked up her coffee. The archive room will be available to you at 11, she said. Miles will provide access. She left. Graham sat for a moment after she was gone. He picked up his pen, put it down again. Then he pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he kept as his lock screened Lily, 3 years ago, standing at the edge of a lake upstate, where they'd gone camping the summer after Ellen died. Yes, he'd admit, Lily was squinting into the sun and making a face that was somewhere between laughing and annoyed. And she looked so much like her mother in that moment that Graham had taken the picture without thinking, an instinct, way you grab for something when you feel it starting to fall. He put the phone back in his pocket and picked up his pen. The archive room confirmed what he'd already suspected, and then exceeded it. The personnel files from 2016 through 2019 were organized in gray metal cabinets along the west wall alphabetical, which meant Graham found his own file without any trouble. He pulled it and stood at the cabinet reading it, and what he read bore almost no resemblance to the reality he had lived. According to the official file, Graham Hale had been terminated for cause in 2018. The cause cited was a combination of information leaking to a competitor, insubordination, and falsification of an internal safety report. He had not been terminated. He had resigned. There was a difference, and the difference mattered not just morally but legally, in terms of what a former employer could and could not communicate to future employers who called for references. He had resigned because he had refused to sign off on a safety report that concealed a manufacturing defect in a batch of pressure valves. The defect was real. He had documented it himself. Vanessa had ordered him to delay the disclosure until after the contract signing 3 weeks. She'd said, just 3 weeks. The contract was worth $40 million, and the disclosure could wait 3 weeks, and he had told her he wouldn't Do it. He had left the same day. What he had not known, because he had not known to check, was that after he left, someone had gone into the file and rewritten the entire story, sloppily, carefully, with the kind of detail that suggested someone understood exactly how future employers would read it, and exactly what words would make Graham Hale permanently unemployable in his industry. He found the timestamp on the file's digital modification record, which existed as a cross-reference note tucked into the paper file, the kind of bureaucratic redundancy that sometimes saves everything. The file had been modified 11 days after his resignation. He photographed it. Then he kept reading. What he found next took longer to understand, because it was buried in the HR correspondence from late 2018, e.g., a chain of internal emails printed and filed between Vanessa's executive assistant, Miles Corbett, and the HR director at the time. The emails discussed finalizing the Hale documentation and ensuring the record reflects the appropriate narrative. Email from Miles to the HR director read, "V wants this airtight. Make sure there's nothing in there that could come back." The HR director's response, "Understood. Will process by end of week." Graham photographed that too. He stood in the archive room for a long time after that, not looking at anything in particular. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and went unanswered. For 8 years, that his file had been altered. He had suspected it from the first job rejection that didn't make sense, confirmed it by the 5th, and by the 10th he had stopped applying for the kind of positions he'd been trained for, and had started building something smaller, from scratch, out of the pieces of a career that someone had deliberately broken. He had never been angry about it in a clean way. It was more complicated than that. It was the kind of thing that gets mixed up with everything else, with the grief, with the financial pressure, with the specific of being a single parent, until it's less a wound and more a weight. Something you carry without always being aware of the carrying. Seeing it in black and white, on paper, in a chain of emails that spelled out the deliberateness of what had been done to him that was different, was its own thing. He pressed his hands flat against the cabinet for a moment, breathed, counted. Then he picked up his camera and kept working. He found Derek Shaw at lunch not by planning it, but because the company cafeteria was on the 3rd floor, and Graham needed food after skipping breakfast. And Derek was there, alone at a corner table, eating something from a container and staring at his phone. Derek looked up when Graham sat down across from him, and the expression that moved across his face was a brief but complete story. Surprise, then calculation, then a practiced, settling into something neutral. "Mr. Hale," he said. "Derek." Graham unwrapped a sandwich he'd picked up from the counter. It was a triangle of white bread and indifferent turkey, and he ate it without complaint. "How's your day going?" "Fine." A pause. "Busy, I imagine." Graham took another bite. "I was looking at the quarterly production reports this morning, the ones from Site 7, and I noticed something interesting about the output figures from lines 2, 4, and 6. Derek's phone screen went dark in his hand. Those figures go through a consolidation process before they reach the quarterly reports. There are aggregation adjustments.
Line 4 has been producing 43 units a day for 11 weeks,
Graham said. The quarterly report shows it at 94% efficiency. Said nothing. "Now, I'm not an accountant," Graham continued pleasantly, "but I'm pretty sure 94% efficiency and 43 units a day don't reconcile. And I'm also pretty sure that 11 weeks of falsified production data doesn't happen by accident. Someone makes a decision to enter the wrong numbers. And then someone makes that decision again. And again. 40, 50, 60 times in a row." He looked at Derek. "That's a very deliberate thing." Derek set his fork down carefully. "I think," he said, "that if you have concerns about reporting accuracy, those concerns should be addressed through the proper review channels." "Which would be?" "I am the review channel," Graham said. "That's what the board told you this morning." "Ms. Sterling has concerns about the scope of Derek." Graham put down his sandwich. "I'm going to be straight with you. I'm not trying to make your life difficult. That you're in a position where you've been following instructions from someone above you, and I know that being in that position feels a lot different from the inside than it looks from the outside." He paused. "But I'm also going to find everything. I have 6 hours left on my review window, and I'm going to find everything there is to find whether you help me or not. The only thing that changes, depending on what you do in the next, is where your name appears in the report. Derek stared at him. I have a family, Derek said very quietly. Graham said, so do the 312 people on the floor at Site 7. That landed. Graham watched it land. Derek's face did something complicated and private, the way faces do when an argument you've been winning inside your own head suddenly collapses. I was told the situation was temporary, Derek said, still quiet, that the numbers would reconcile within 2 quarters. It was a bridge, not a... He stopped. I was told a lot of things. I believe you, Graham said. Derek looked at him. Yes, that's exactly how this works. Graham picked up his sandwich again. Eat your lunch. I'll need you available this afternoon. Derek looked down at his food container, then back up. She's not going to let this go easily, he said. You understand that. Vanessa, she doesn't. This isn't someone who accepts losing. Graham said. She destroyed you once. She tried. Graham finished his sandwich and balled up the wrapper. She had a better angle that time. The board call came at 3:15. Margaret's voice on the phone was level, which was how Graham had begun to understand she communicated urgency, not by raising her voice, but by removing all the warmth from it. We've had a communication from Miles Corbett, Margaret said. He's filed a formal objection to your access level and is arguing that some of the documents you've requested fall outside the scope of your review mandate. Which documents specifically? The personnel files from 2016 through 2019. And the Sterling Recovery Framework Archive. Graham was quiet for a moment. Margaret, he said, has anyone told you what the Sterling Recovery Framework actually is? A pause on her end. Tell me, she said, he told her. The silence afterward was the kind that happens when someone is deciding between disbelief and belief and lands. Reluctantly on belief, because the alternative requires more effort. I see, Margaret said finally. I've photographed the original documentation. The cross-reference timestamps, the email chain authorizing the modification of my personnel file. He paused. I haven't copied any of it to a personal device. Everything is preserved on the board's independent secure server that your IT team set up yesterday. Good, Margaret said, and there was something in her voice that he hadn't heard before, something that might have been relief. Keep working. I'll handle Miles. She hung up. Graham stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the parking lot, where the same 2 security vehicles were making the same slow rounds as last night. The sky was doing something complicated. Clouds, building in the west, the light going yellow and strange. It looked like it might rain. He thought about Ellen again. She used to love days when the light went yellow before a storm. She'd pull him outside onto whatever porch or balcony or sidewalk was available and make him stand in it with her. Look at that, she'd say every time, like it was the first time. Look at that light. He'd always been impatient, always had somewhere else to be, or something else to think about. He missed that now, with a specificity that sometimes still surprised him, even 3 years out. Just her, but all the small things he'd been too busy to stand still for. He stayed at the window a little longer than he needed to. Then he turned around and went back to work. He found Claire Donovan at 4:47, and it almost happened by accident. The HR department occupied a suite of offices on the 4th floor, and Graham had gone up to ask about a discrepancy in the onboarding records for a particular class of factory workers. Not because the onboarding records were central to his review, because one of Patricia's gray cabinet files had referenced them, and Graham had learned in the last 30 hours to follow every thread. Claire Donovan was the current HR director. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, with dark hair going gray, and the kind of face that looked like it had been keeping something inside it for a long time. When Graham walked into her office and introduced himself, she stood up from her desk and extended her hand. And he noticed that her hand was not entirely steady. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I've been expecting you might come up." "Call me Graham," he said. "Can I sit?" "Please." He sat. She sat. He asked about the onboarding records. She answered clearly, concisely, apparently normal. But she kept her hands flat on the desk in front of her, fingers spread the way people do when they're trying to hold something still. He answered a few of her questions, asked a few of his own. Standard exchange. And then he said, without planning to, "How long have you been HR director?" 6 years, she said. Who was director before you? A pause. A man named Phil Greer, no relation to Tom. And before Phil, she looked at him. Sandra Cho. And Sandra left when? 2018, Claire said. Her voice had gone slightly flat. Nefiti. November 2018. November 2018 was 1 month after the emails authorizing the modification of Graham's personnel file. He didn't say that. He just looked at Claire Donovan, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that didn't need to be put into words. I wasn't here when it happened, she said quietly. I want you to know that. I started in January 2019. When I was onboarding, I found some things in the archived files that I didn't understand initially. And then you did understand them, Graham said. She pressed her fingers harder against the desk. I should have done something, she said. I know that. I've known for years that I should have. She stopped, started again. There's a family. My mother is in a care facility. My son is in college. I didn't feel like I could. Claire, Graham said, and his voice was quiet, accusatory. I understand that. Genuinely. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. I have the original file, she said. Graham's your original file. The one from before it was changed. Sandra kept a copy. I don't know why she kept it. Maybe she knew someday someone would need it. She left it in the archive with a note that just said, keep this. So I did. He was very still. I'd like to see it, he said. She opened her desk drawer. She pulled out a manila envelope. She set it on the desk between them. It doesn't fix what happened to you, she said. I know that. No, Graham agreed. But it might fix what's still happening to the people in this building. He reached across the desk and picked up the envelope. Outside, through the fourth-floor window, the first drops of rain had begun to hit the glass, and the strange yellow light that had been building all afternoon finally broke open into something gray and enormous and clean. The rain had been coming down for 2 hours by the time Graham got back to the third-floor conference room, and it showed no signs of stopping. He spread Claire's envelope across the table alongside everything else he'd collected: Patricia's gray cabinet records, the archive photographs, Derek's production figures, email chain with Miles's name on it. And for a few minutes, he just stood there looking at all of it together, reading, just looking, the way you stand back from something to see its shape before you start working on it. The shape was not good. It was not one bad decision made under pressure. It was not a temporary bridge that got out of hand, the way Derek had described it. What was spread across that conference table represented years of deliberate choices, layered on top of each other. Like sediment, each one making the next one easier. Each one burying the original problem a little deeper, until the original problem was so far down nobody, without a reason to dig, would ever find it. He thought about what Vanessa had said to him yesterday morning. 17,000 employees. She'd said it like a shield. And it was a real thing, a real weight. The reality that a company this size collapsing would cost thousands of ordinary people their livelihoods. He didn't dismiss that. He never had. But 17,000 employees were already at risk. They just didn't know it yet, because the people managing their risk had been managing this instead of the problem. He sat down, opened his laptop, and began writing the report. He had been writing for 40 minutes when his access cut out. Slowly, not with a warning. One moment he was inside Northstar's secure document server, cross-referencing the supplier payment records against the falsified quarterly figures. The next moment the screen went gray and a single line appeared. Session terminated, authorization revoked. He stared at it. Then he picked up his phone and called Margaret. She picked up on the second ring. Graham, my system access just got cut, he said. A pause. When? About 30 seconds ago, another pause longer. He could hear her doing something on her end, typing, maybe, or moving. I'm looking at it now. It went through the company's IT administrative portal. The authorization was signed off by. She stopped. By whom? Graham said. Miles Corbett, Margaret said, with a security override citing suspected data theft. The room felt very quiet for a moment, with only the rain against the window and the sound of his own breathing. He's alleging that I stole data, Graham said. That's what the filing says. It also says that you've been copying proprietary documents to a personal device in violation of your access agreement. Margaret's voice was controlled in the way that meant she was working hard to keep it that way. I need you to tell me right now, did you copy anything to a personal device? Graham said. Everything I photographed or documented went directly to the board's independent server. IT team has the access logs. They can verify exactly what went where and when. Good, Margaret said. Then the logs will clear it. But she paused. This is going to take time to unwind. Miles knows that. This isn't about actually proving you stole something. It's about stopping the clock. He had been thinking the same thing. He had 48 hours. He'd used just over 36 of them. He had roughly 12 left, and now he was 12 left and facing a formal allegation that would require the board's IT team to conduct their own access review before he could be reinstated. That review would take time. Time he did not have. How fast can your IT team run the log verification? He asked. Realistically, 3 to 4 hours. 3 to 4 hours. Which left him 8, maybe less. Margaret, he said, whatever Miles is trying to delete right now, the board's server needs to be locked down. Immediately. Independent control, company administrative override. Silence. You think he's going to try to delete the files, she said. I think he already is, Graham said. I think cutting my access and filing the data theft allegation is exactly the kind of move you make when you need someone occupied somewhere else while you clean up somewhere over here. He heard Margaret exhale. I'll call IT now. She hung up. Graham set the phone down on the table and looked at the gray screen of his laptop. It was locked out of the digital records. He couldn't access the server. He had a formal allegation against him that would need to be processed before he could move forward through official channels. He looked at the manila envelope from Claire, at Patricia's paper records, at his handwritten notes from 36 hours of walking floors and reading from files and talking to people who were exhausted from carrying things they'd never been meant to carry alone. He still had those. He picked up his pen and kept writing. Miles arrived 22 minutes later. He came with 2 members of North Star's internal security large, professionally neutral men in dark jackets who positioned themselves in the hallway outside the conference room door with the practiced ease of people who did this kind of thing regularly. Miles himself came in alone and sat across from Graham and set a document on the table between them. Notice, Miles said. Pending investigation of the data breach allegation, your review access has been suspended under Section 14 of the Board Engagement Agreement. I'm sure you've already spoken to Margaret, so I won't belabor the procedural points. Graham looked at the document. He didn't pick it up. Section 14 requires a finding of probable cause before access can be suspended, he said. A filing isn't a finding. An emergency provision allows for temporary suspension pending the finding. Emergency provision requires board approval. Did the full board vote on this? Miles's expression shifted just slightly. A quorum? Did the full board vote? Graham repeated. A pause. 4 members approved the emergency provision. There are 8 board members. 4 is a quorum only if the chair concurs. Did Margaret concur? Miles said nothing, and his silence was the answer. You got 4 votes without the chair, Graham said. That's not a quorum for an emergency provision. That's 4 people. He slid the document back across the table. I'm going to need a valid board order before I stop working, Miles. Miles looked at him for a long moment. Something did in his face not quite anger, more like the expression of a man who has just recalculated and found the number worse than he expected. Miles said, leaning back slightly, I've been doing this for 20 years. Corporate law, crisis management, executive protection. And in 20 years, I have sat across from a lot of people who came into a situation they didn't fully understand and convinced themselves they had the full picture. He paused. You've been here 36 hours. You've talked, he'd intervened. You've talked to some floor workers and a handful of middle managers, and you've looked at some numbers that you're interpreting through a framework that hasn't been tested in a real operating environment in 8 years. The numbers aren't really open to interpretation, Graham said. Everything is open to interpretation. That's why we have attorneys. Miles straightened his jacket. What I'm trying to explain to you as a professional courtesy is that what you think you've found and what is actually true are not necessarily the same thing. And the distance between those two things, when this reaches any kind of formal proceeding, will be argued by people who do this for a living. Graham said, I'm counting on it. Miles blinked. Just once, excuse me? The arguments, the formal proceedings. Graham folded his hands on the table. I want this in front of people who do this for a living. I want every number I've found examined by the most competent accountants and litigators the board can retain, because I'm very confident about what those numbers say. He paused. Are you? The silence that followed was a specific kind, the kind that exists not because nothing is being said, but because the person across from you is deciding what to say next, and the decision is harder than they expected it to be. Miles stood up. He took the document off the table and tucked it back inside his jacket. This isn't over, he said. No, Graham agreed. It's not. After Miles left, Graham sat for a moment. His heart was moving faster than he wanted it to, and his hands, flat on the table, were not entirely steady. He pressed them down harder against the surface until they were. Then he got up and went to find Derek Shaw. Derek was in his office on the 5th floor with the door closed and the blinds angled down. When Graham knocked and pushed the door open, Derek was at his desk with his laptop open, and the expression of a man who had been staring at something for a long time without seeing it. They cut your access, Derek said. It wasn't a question. Half an hour ago. Graham came in and closed the door behind him. Miles is trying to freeze the review until the clock runs out. Derek rubbed a hand across his face. He looked worse than he had at lunch, Grayer, somehow as if the afternoon had used him up. She's serious about ending this, he said. You understand that. When Vanessa decides something is a threat, she goes all the way. Graham sat down. Derek, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. Derek looked at him. The financial models, Graham said. The ones that support the quarterly reports. Where do they live? Not the summary documents, the actual models. The spreadsheets, the raw inputs, the assumptions. Derek was quiet. There's a copy, he said finally. An offline copy. Not on the company server, he paused. I made it 8 months ago, when I started to realize how bad it was getting. He looked at Graham with something that was not quite shame and not quite pride, but lived in the neighborhood of both. What I did, I know I should have done something sooner, but I made that copy because I needed to know that if it all came apart, there was something somewhere that showed what the real numbers were. Where is it? An external drive. At my home. Graham thought for a moment. Can you get it here within 2 hours? My wife could bring it. Call her, Graham said, right now. And Derek, does anyone else know it exists? Keep it that way. Graham stood up. And send me the full supplier payment logs from the last 18 months before Miles gets the idea to restrict your access to. Derek was already reaching for his phone. The call from Margaret came at 6:44. The IT team finished the log review, she said. You didn't copy a single document to a personal device. Everything is exactly where it should be. A pause. Yes, he intervened. Miles filed the allegation anyway, which tells the board something about the quality of his judgment right now. Or the quality of his desperation, Graham said. Both. Your access will be restored within the hour. Another pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, lower, more deliberate. Graham, the board's independent server. The file preservation request you submitted last night. Our IT team flagged something about 20 minutes ago. Someone attempted to access those files from inside the North Star administrative network and delete a specific subfolder. Graham's hand tightened around the phone. Which subfolder? The one containing the Sterling Recovery Framework. Originals, Margaret said. The email chain from 2018. The room was very quiet. Did they get in? Graham said. No. The independent server doesn't accept administrative overrides from the company network. That's the point of independent. But the attempt was logged. She paused. Along with the username that initiated it. Miles, Graham said. Margaret confirmed. He let out a slow breath. You have that log. Secured and copied to 3 separate locations in the last 15 minutes, she said. Yes, he sat down in the chair that happened to be behind him. His legs felt suddenly uncertain, not afraid. Exactly. More like the physical version of a long exhale. The thing he'd been bracing against for 36 hours had swung at him and missed, and his body was catching up to that fact. Grandmargaret said, Are you all right? Yeah, he said. Give me a minute. She gave him the minute. He sat in the small conference room on the third floor of North Star's administrative building with the rain still coming down outside and all this paper evidence still spread across the table in front of him. And he breathed. 4 counts in, hold 4 out. I'm good, he said. What do we do now? Now, Margaret said, I think it's time to have a conversation with Arthur Sterling. He hadn't expected that. Arthur Sterling was 71 years old and had been largely removed from North Star's day-to-day operations for 4 years, since handing the reins to Vanessa in a succession process that had been covered extensively in the business press. Semi-retired, the article said, spending more time at his property in Connecticut, proud of his daughter's achievements, still on the board as founder, but attending meetings by video more often than in person. Yes, he'd intervened. Graham had not factored Arthur into his thinking, because Arthur was not part of the story he'd been investigating. Arthur was history, or so he'd thought. Why Arthur? Graham asked. Because, Margaret said, the authorization for the modification of your personnel file in 2018, the one that required a senior executive signature to go through HR's formal record system, was signed with Arthur Sterling's credentials. Graham was very still. Arthur was still active in 2018. He was, but the signature on that authorization was applied at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. Arthur Sterling, in my experience of 20 years on this board, has never worked past 6 o'clock in his life. A pause. I called him an hour ago and told him what we found. He's driving in tonight. He didn't know, Graham said. It wasn't a question. He didn't know, Margaret confirmed. And whatever you may think of Arthur Sterling, whatever complicated history his company has with you, I intervened. I want you to understand that the man who is driving 3 hours in the rain right now to sit in this building and deal with what his daughter did using his name, that man is not what you're used to dealing with. Graham thought about that. When does he arrive? 9, maybe 9:30. I'd like you there. I'll be there, Graham said. He hung up and sat for a moment. Outside, a car moved through the parking lot below, its headlights sweeping across the wet asphalt, and the light traveled across the ceiling of the conference room in a slow arc before disappearing. He thought about what it would be like to be Arthur Sterling right now, to be 71 years old, to have built something over 4 decades, to have trusted it to someone who shared your name, your blood, your history, and to be driving through the rain on a Wednesday night to find out what that trust had cost. He didn't feel satisfaction about that. He felt something more complicated, something closer to the feeling you get when you finally stop running from something and turn around to face it, and it turns out to be smaller and sadder than the thing you'd built it into in your head. No. He pulled out his phone, called Lily. Hey, she said, picking up on the 3rd ring. She sounded like she'd been awake for, which, at 9 in the evening on a school night probably meant she'd been worried. She would never say that, because she was 16, and saying it directly would require too much exposure. But Graham had learned her language. He said, How was the lab? Fine. Chemical bonding is actually kind of interesting when you get into it. It's basically just about what things are attracted to and what they're trying to hold on to. He smiled despite himself. Deep for a Wednesday. I have my moments, a pause. You sound different. Different how? Less. She seemed to be searching for the word. Less compressed, like something loosened up. Things moved forward today, he said. Good forward or complicated forward? Complicated. But the right kind of complicated. Okay. He could hear her shifting position, probably on the couch. Probably with the television muted the way she watched it when she was actually thinking about something else. Dad, are you coming home tonight? He looked at his watch. 8:10. Arthur Sterling would arrive in an hour, maybe more. After that, he didn't know. Probably not until late, he said. Maybe very late. Don't wait up. I'm not going to promise that. I'm just saying I can't promise something I have no intention of doing. He put his hand over his eyes for a moment. This was exactly like her mother. Precise, cheerful refusal to tell you what you wanted to hear. Ellen had done it their entire marriage, with the same mild expression, the same light in her eyes. He used to find it infuriating. Now it made his chest ache in a way that wasn't entirely bad. Do your homework, he said. Done. Go read something. I have been reading. Go, Dad, I'm fine. Do what you need to do. I'll be here. A pause. I'll leave the light on. Intervened. He drove back toward the main building through the rain, parked badly in a space near the side entrance, and sat in the car for a moment, listening to the water hit the roof. He thought about the 43 pages of his framework with someone else's name, where his used to be. He thought about Tom Greer on the factory floor, absorbing pressure from both sides. Patricia and her gray cabinets. About Derek and his external drive. About Claire's hands pressed flat against her desk. All these people, carrying things. All these people who had seen what was true and had been too small or too afraid or too financially exposed to say it out loud, and who had compensated by keeping their own quiet records, their own private copies of the truth, just in case the day came. Today was the day. He got out of the car and walked into the rain. Arthur Sterling arrived at 9:47. He was a tall man, still broad through the shoulders, despite his age, with white hair and the particular kind of face that looks like it was built for weathering things. He had driven himself, no assistant, no driver, and he came in through the main entrance in a dark coat with rain on his shoulders, and when he walked through the lobby, the security guard at the desk stood up without being asked. Graham was waiting in the main conference room with Margaret when Arthur was brought in.
Huh?
Arthur looked at Margaret first, then at Graham, and something moved across his face that was impossible to fully read recognition, maybe, or the effort of recognition. "Graham Hale," Arthur said. "Mr. Sterling." Arthur sat down across from them. He did not take off his coat. He folded his hands on the table in front of him, large hands, still steady, and looked at Margaret. "Show me what you found." Margaret walked him through it methodically. The production figures, the inventory discrepancies, the falsified quarterly reports, the supplier debts, then the personnel records, then the email chain, then the authorization signature. Arthur didn't interrupt. He sat very still and looked at each document as Margaret placed it in front of him, and his face did the thing that faces do when they are trying not to do anything completely controlled on the surface, for that reason somehow more visible underneath. When Margaret was done, Arthur sat for a long moment without speaking. "My credentials," he said finally. His voice was steady, but not without effort. "She used my credentials. The digital signature matches your executive access code," Margaret said, "which she would have had as your successor. The authorization for the personnel file." Arthur looked at Graham. "Directly, without intermediary. The file that was changed was yours." "Yes," Graham said. "You resigned in 2018. I resigned because I refused to delay a safety disclosure. And then the file was changed to say you were terminated for cause." "Correct." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Very precisely, I did not authorize that." Graham said. Arthur looked at him for another moment. "You knew I didn't authorize it? Or you suspected?" Graham considered the question honestly. "I suspected," he said. Now Arthur nodded, once slowly. Then he looked at Margaret. "I want to speak to Vanessa." "Arthur, I want to speak to my daughter," he said, loudly, just finally. Margaret made a phone call. 12 minutes later, Vanessa Sterling walked into the conference room, and when she saw her father sitting at the table with his coat still on and his hands folded in front of him, her step slowed by exactly one beat before she controlled it. Her voice was careful. "Sit down, Vanessa." She sat, not in her usual place, not the power position, the center of the long side. She sat where there rested, which happened a chair available, to be next to Margaret, and she arranged herself with the composure she had always used as armor, and looked at her father. Arthur slid the authorization document across the table to her. She looked at it. She did not say anything for a long moment. "You used my credentials," Arthur said. The room was very quiet. The rain had lightened outside, not stopped, just lightened. The heavy part of the storm having moved through, while they'd been inside dealing with what it left behind. The situation was Vanessa started. "You used my name," Arthur said. And there was something in his voice that was not anger, exactly. Something older and heavier than anger. The sound of a man confronting something he had been hoping was not true. To destroy an employee who did the right thing. "You used my name." Vanessa looked at the document for another moment. Then she looked up, not at her father, but at Graham. And her eyes, for the first time since he'd walked into the building 2 days ago, held something that wasn't calculation or contempt or professional composure. It was closer to exhaustion. "You've been building this case for 8 years, she said. "I've been living my life for 8 years, Graham said. "This took 2 days. She looked back at her father. The company was in trouble, she said, and her voice had lost its usual precision, not broken, but worn down to something simpler. The contracts were falling through. The production costs were killing the margins. If that safety disclosure had gone out before the Meridian contract was signed, we would have lost it. We would have lost everything we'd spent 2 years building, she said, to her father. Just to him. The 2 words held more in them than anything else she had said in 2 days. They were not an apology. Vanessa Sterling was not yet capable of an apology in any form Graham would recognize. But they were an acknowledgement, and for the moment, in that room with her father, across from her and the rain against the windows, and everything spread on the table between them, they were enough. Arthur stood up. He buttoned his coat. He looked at Margaret. Whatever the board decides, he said, I will not interfere, and I will not protect. He stopped for a moment. I will not protect decisions that were made under my name without my knowledge. He looked at Graham one last time. Mr. Hale, you deserved better from this company 8 years ago. Graham looked at him. Yes, he said. I did. Arthur walked out. The room was silent for a moment after the door closed. Miles Corbett, who had appeared sometime in the last few minutes and been standing near the far wall, said, This doesn't change anything operationally. Review period expires in... Sit down, Miles, Margaret said. Miles sat. Graham looked across the table at Vanessa. She was still looking at the door her father had just walked through, and her composure was assembled around her again. Carefully, piece by piece, the way you pick up something that's broken and hold the pieces together with your hands. You still have to prove you can run this company, he said, not looking at Graham. Her voice was quiet and controlled and meant it. Exposing what happened doesn't mean you can fix it. Graham, it doesn't. So fix it, she said. And she looked at him then, and whatever else was in her eyes, there was also almost, despite itself, something that might have been a challenge offered in good faith. You have 12 hours. Let's see what you can actually do. Graham looked at her for a moment. Then he opened his notebook to a fresh page. The notebook was a standard composition book, the kind you find at drugstores for $2 and change. Black cover, slightly bent at the corner from being carried in the same bag as Graham's water bottle. He'd bought it the morning before walking into North Star's headquarters because he'd learned, over 8 years of consulting, that he thought better on paper than on screens, and that there was something about a $2 notebook that kept his thinking honest. Yet, you didn't write performance in a $2 notebook. You wrote what was actually true. He opened it to a fresh page and wrote one line at the top. What does North Star actually need? What the board wanted to hear. Note what would satisfy the review criteria. What would make a good headline in the financial press. What the company, the actual organism of it, the factory floors and the supplier relationships and the 312 workers at Site 7 and the 16,688 others across the rest of the operation actually needed to survive. He wrote for 20 minutes without stopping, just dumping everything onto the page in no particular order, way his 8th grade English teacher had called free writing, and which Graham had never stopped doing because it turned out to be the only reliable way he knew to get from the noise in his head to the thing underneath the noise. Margaret had given him the small conference room for the night. Someone had brought in a tray with coffee and a sandwich at some point, he didn't know who, didn't look up to see, and the coffee was lukewarm by the time he reached for it, but he drank it anyway. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The parking lot was empty except for a handful of cars belonging to the night security crew, and, at the far end, near the executive entrance, Arthur Sterling's dark sedan, which had not moved. Arthur was still in the building somewhere. Graham thought about that as he wrote. What it cost a man to drive 3 hours in the rain on a Wednesday night to sit in the building he'd built over 40 years and acknowledge that something done in his name was wrong. Arthur Sterling was not a simple man. No one who built a multi-billion-dollar industrial operation from nothing was a simple man, and Graham was not naive enough to romanticize him. But something about Arthur's presence in the building tonight, the coat still on, the hands steady, the 2 words he'd said to Graham before leaving the room, you deserved better. Those words mattered in a way Graham hadn't expected them to. He'd spent 8 years not expecting anything from Arthur Sterling. He set that aside and kept writing. By 11:30, he had filled 14 pages, and his hand was cramping. He set the pen down, flexed his fingers, and read back through what he'd written. He crossed things out, drew arrows between sections, added notes in the margins in a handwriting that would have been illegible to anyone who wasn't him. The shape of something was forming. Not a plan, yet more like the outline of a plan, the skeleton of it, the thing you have to get right before you can build anything on top of it. He picked up his phone and called Derek. Derek answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping. The executive compensation structure, Graham said. Who put it together? A pause, mostly Vanessa, with Miles's input on the legal framework. What's the total annual package for the top 6 executives? Bonus, benefits, allowances, everything. Another pause longer. Graham could hear Derek moving a chair, maybe, the sound of a drawer opening. Combined, around 41 million, give or take. The bonuses paid in the last fiscal year. Were those paid before or after the quarterly reports were finalized? Before, Derek said. About 3 weeks before. Before the falsified reports were submitted to the board. Silence, Derek. Yes, Derek's quietly, before. Graham wrote that down. The corporate jet. What does it cost to operate annually? Including crew, fuel, maintenance, hangar fees, around 3.2 million. The executive properties. The company owns 3: the Manhattan apartment, the Scottsdale retreat, and the lodge in Vermont. 4, Derek said. There's also a townhouse in Georgetown that came off the books under a subsidiary 2 years ago. I don't think the full board knows about it. Graham was very still for a moment. Is that in the financial statements? It's in a subsidiary ledger. The subsidiary numbers roll up into the consolidated statements, but the property itself isn't itemized separately. A pause. I know how that sounds. What are the 4 properties worth combined? Current market value probably 19 million. Graham wrote, and the company cars. How many executive vehicles on the fleet account? 11, including 3 that are currently assigned to executives who haven't been in the office in over a year. He kept writing. The skeleton was filling in. Derek, Graham said. The Meridian contractor. The one Vanessa was protecting 8 years ago when she ordered the disclosure delay. We lost it anyway, Derek said, 2 years after it was signed. Product liability claims from the defective valves. Graham had suspected as much. What did the liability settlement cost? 14 million, plus legal fees. He set down his pen for a moment. $40 million. That was what Vanessa had been protecting when she ordered Graham to falsify a safety report. And then, when he refused, destroyed his career and rewrote his personnel file. $40 million in potential revenue from a contract that ultimately cost $14 million in liability, plus 8 years of institutional rot as the company learned, at every level, that the truth was negotiable if the number was large enough. He thought about Ellen, about sitting in hospital waiting rooms, doing the math on treatment costs versus what their insurance would cover, about selling those because the medical bills were real, and the house was the only asset that was also real. The math did not care about anything except the math. He picked up his pen and finished the page. At 1 in the morning, he knocked on the door of the office where Margaret had set up for the night. She opened it quickly, which told him she also hadn't been sleeping. I have something, he said. She stepped back and let him in. The office was a generic executive suite, someone's secondary space, probably not their primary office. A desk, 2 chairs, a credenza with a lamp. Margaret had set up her laptop and had 3 neat stacks of documents arranged on the desk with the organization of someone who had been in enough late-night crisis situations to develop a system. Graham spread his notebook open on the credenza and walked her through it. The plan was not elegant. He knew that going in, and he said so. It was not the kind of financial restructuring that business school professors used as case studies. It was the kind that a man who'd spent 8 years rebuilding something from nothing put together at 1 in the morning in a rented conference room, and its primary virtue was not sophistication, but honesty. The core of it was simple. The problem was not the company's 17,000 workers. The problem was the layer above them. The bonuses paid from falsified results, approximately $6.8 million, distributed among the top 8 executives in the last fiscal year, could be legally recovered through the board's fiduciary authority if the payments were. found to have been made from fraudulent financial statements. Recovery would not happen overnight, but the filing could begin immediately and would signal to suppliers and creditors that the board was taking concrete action. The corporate jet, the 4 executive properties, and the 11-vehicle fleet represented assets totaling approximately $23 million at current market value. Selling them would take time, but establishing the board's intent to liquidate them could be done in the next 48 hours, which would shore up creditor confidence enough to prevent any immediate default filings. The supplier debt's 72 supplies, or total outstanding past due around $31 million, could not be paid immediately. Graham had spent part of the previous night reading through the supplier contracts, and he had found something that Vanessa's team had apparently not considered important. 11 of North Star's 12 largest suppliers had renewal clauses with performance-based renegotiation windows that were currently open. Those windows existed because they'd been written into contracts to protect the suppliers in exactly the scenario they were now facing. A direct conversation with those suppliers, not a letter, not a legal notice, an actual conversation, executive to executive, combined with a concrete repayment schedule and the visibility of what the board was doing to address the root cause, had a reasonable chance of preventing those suppliers from filing formal breach notices for 60 to 90 days. 60 to 90 days was enough to stabilize the immediate situation. The Hansen contract, which was the largest active production order, and the one that line force breakdown jeopardizing, could potentially be salvaged. Graham had found buried in the production records that lines 2 and 3 at Site 7 were currently running at 62% of capacity, not because of equipment failure, but because of a scheduling inefficiency that had been in place for 3 years and never corrected. Fixing the scheduling would not recover Line 4's output, but it would recover enough production capacity that the Hansen delivery timeline could be renegotiated by weeks, not months, which was the difference between a contract renegotiation and a contract termination. In the Sterling recovery framework, the 43 pages of methodology that Graham had built at a kitchen table while his wife slept on the couch, with his name removed and Vanessa's substituted, was, at its core, a system for exactly this kind of situation. For identifying where a manufacturing organization was wasting resources, not at the production level but at the administrative level, and redirecting those resources toward the operational foundation. Graham had built that system because he'd believed in it. He still believed in it. He just wanted his name back on it. The framework, Margaret said, looking at his notes. Are you planning to use it? I'm going to use it, and I'm going to name it what it is, Graham said. The original Hale recovery framework. The board can deal with the attribution question separately. Margaret looked at him for a moment. You know that using it as the basis for your plan, naming it, is going to look like personal aggrandizement to some of the board members. And you're doing it anyway. Margaret, he said, I spent 8 years not having my name on something I built. I'm done with that. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the notebook. What's the timeline? 90 days to stabilize. 12 months to full operational recovery, assuming we can retain the supplier relationships and execute the production schedule corrections. He paused. Without laying off a single hourly manufacturing employee, she was quiet for a moment. The board is going to ask how you can guarantee that. I can't guarantee it, Graham said. I can show them the math. The math says the fat is not on the factory floor. The fat is at the top, and there's enough of it to absorb what the company needs without touching the people who actually make things. He paused. The executive layer costs this company north of $40 million a year in compensation and benefits and assets and overhead. If you cut that layer down to reasonable, not eliminate it, just make it you free up enough to service the supplier debts, repair the broken equipment, and fund the production recovery. Vanessa will call that punitive, Margaret said. It's not punitive, Graham said. It's math, he paused. Vanessa's annual package salary, bonus car, property allowances, jet access runs to about $9.4 million. My proposal would reduce that to 1.8, which is still, just to be clear, $1.8 million a year. She won't accept it. She may not have a choice, Graham said. That depends on what the board decides. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, reading back through his notes. The workforce, she said. The 312 at Site 7. And the others. Protected, Graham said. The plan doesn't work if they're not. And more than that, they're the only part of this company that has actually been doing what it was supposed to do. Cutting them to protect an executive compensation structure that was funded by false numbers is not a restructuring. It's a continuation of the same thinking that got us here. Margaret closed the notebook and looked at him. You should sleep, she said. I'll sleep when the meeting's over. Graham, the meeting is in 7 hours. He picked up the notebook. I have a few more calls to make. Yes, intervened. She watched him for a moment with the expression when choosing between practical concern and professional respect, and settling, reluctantly, on professional respect. There's a couch in the third-floor lounge, she said. Use it for at least 2 hours. I'll try. He did not try, but he meant to. He called Tom Greer at 2:15 in the morning, and Tom picked up on the second ring with the alert, slightly rough voice of a man who had also not been sleeping. Graham Hale. Yeah. A pause. I figured you'd call. The production schedule for lines 2 and 3. The one that's been in place for 3 years. Who said it? A long pause. Corporate efficiency team. Came in, did a 2-day assessment, left a new schedule. Did anyone on the floor flag that it was running the lines under capacity? I flagged it, Tom said. Twice. Got told the schedule was optimized for parts availability, and that the floor team's job was to run the schedule, not question it. If I gave you authority to reset the scheduling on 2 and 3 to full capacity production, how fast could you do it? Silence. Then if I have the authority and the parts? Parts aren't the issue on 2 and 3. They're mechanical and they're sound. The schedule's the issue. I could have them at full capacity by morning shift. Graham said, do it. Tom's voice shifted. You have authority to tell me to. I'll have the board authorization to you by 5 a.m., Graham said. I need you ready to run when it comes through. Another pause. And then something in Tom Greer's voice that Graham recognized, the sound of a man who had been holding something back for a long time and had just been given permission to set it down. Mr. Hale, Tom said. Graham. Tom paused. What it's been like down here these last couple years. The numbers were wrong, knowing. The reports were knowing things were being reported that weren't true. And not being able to, you're a floor manager. You run the floor. You don't go to the board and say the CFO is lying. You just stopped. You just hold it together as long as you can. Graham said. The people on that floor, Tom, they work hard. They show up. They don't. They just want to do their jobs and know that the company you quote for isn't going to disappear on them. Graham said again. That's what I'm trying to make sure of. Tom's voice settled. 5 a.m. I'll be ready. The supplier calls were harder. Graham made 11 of them between 2:30 and 4 in the morning, working through the list he'd built from the contract files. He introduced himself on every call the same way, his name, his current role, and acknowledged that he was calling at an unreasonable hour, an apology for that, and then the direct version of why he was calling. He did not make promises he couldn't keep. He did not pretend the situation was better than it was. He told each supplier the same thing, that the board had identified scariest in how the company's finances had been managed, that they were in the process of addressing those problems at the executive level, that the debts owed to each supplier were real, and the board intended to honor them through a structured repayment schedule, and that he was calling personally because he believed the supplier relationship was worth preserving, and he wanted to ask, not demand, for 60 days of breathing room. Some of them said they'd think about it. 2 hung up. One told Graham flatly that 60 days was impossible, and 45 was the most they could offer, and Graham said 45 it was, and thanked them, and meant it. 8 of the 11 agreed in principle to extend, pending receipt of a formal repayment commitment from the board. 8 out of 11, at 3 in the morning, was more than he'd expected. He called Margaret after the last one. 8, he said. 8, she repeated. And the other 3? 2 are thinking. One gave us 45 days instead of 60. I took it. She was quiet for a moment. You know, most people in your position would have sent a letter. Letters don't work, Graham said. People work. He heard her exhale softly on the other end. Get some rest, Graham. He lay down on the couch in the third-floor lounge at 4:15. He was asleep within 2 minutes. Lily called at 6:53. was already awake, had been since 6:30, sitting up on the couch with his notebook, going over the plan one more time with the particular fresh-eyed cruelty of early morning, looking for the places where it fell apart. He found 3 spots that needed more support and was working on them when his phone rang. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She sounded like she'd slept, which was a relief. "How long did you sleep?" "Long enough." "Dad." 2 hours. Almost 2 hours. A pause. "Are you okay?" He looked at the notebook in his hands. At 14 pages of his own handwriting, the plan he'd built through the night, from everything he'd learned in 38 hours inside North Star's walls. At the cracked corner of his briefcase, sitting against the leg of the couch, he said, "I think I actually am. The big meeting is today? In a couple hours. Are you scared?" He thought about that seriously, because Lily asked serious questions and deserved serious answers. "Not scared," he said. "More like focused. The way you get right before something where you've done everything you can do, and now it's just about doing it. Like before a test," she said. Exactly like before a test. She was quiet for a moment. "Then I made a decision." "About what?" "After college. I've been thinking about what I want to study," and I think she paused. "I think I want to do something with systems. Like how organizations work and why they break down and what you need to fix them. I don't know what that's called exactly. Maybe operations. Maybe something else." He sat with that for a moment. His 16-year-old daughter, his 16, who had grown up watching him rebuild a career from pieces, who had watched her mother fight for 3 years and lose, who had eaten granola bars for breakfast and left the light on this daughter, telling him at 6:53 in the morning that she wanted to spend her life figuring out how to fix broken things. "That's called a lot of things," he said. "But you're good at it." "I haven't done it yet." "You've been doing it your whole life," he said. "You just haven't had an official title." She made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Do your meeting, Dad." "I'm going." He paused. "I love you, Lily Bird." "I love you too, don't blow it." "Thank you for that." "I'm kidding. You won't blow it." He put the phone in his pocket and stood up and straightened his tie in the reflection of the dark window, which was imprecise but sufficient. His suit had been on his body for going on 2 days, and looked it. His shoes, on the floor, beside the couch, had a new scuff on the left toe from where he'd caught it on the edge of the archive cabinet door the previous afternoon. He picked them up and put them on. The same shoes. Still the same shoes. He picked up his notebook and his briefcase and went to face the board. The emergency board meeting was called for 9 a.m. in the main conference room. All 8 board members were present in person, unusual, Margaret had told him, since 2 of them typically attended by video. Something about the weight of what was happening had apparently convinced even the remote attendees that this was not a video call situation. Vanessa was there. She sat at the center of the long side of the table, her usual position, reclaimed. She was in black today, and her composure was fully restored, assembled with the precision of someone who had spent the night deciding how to face a room that knew everything. Miles was absent. He had been formally suspended from his role, pending the board's investigation of the file deletion attempt. The chair beside her, where Miles usually sat, was empty. Derek was there, near the far end of the table. He had the external drive in his jacket pocket. He had told Graham this at 8:45 in the hallway outside, patting his pocket once, a small and private gesture that meant, "I'm here. I'm doing it." Graham sat at the end of the table where Margaret directed him, which happened to be the same end where he'd sat 2 days ago when he placed the sealed envelope on the table and told Vanessa he had not come to ask for a job. That felt like a long time ago. Margaret opened the meeting with a brief summary of what the review had uncovered, not all of it. Not in granular detail, but enough. Falsified production reports, misrepresented inventory, undisclosed liabilities, supplier debts in default, executive compensation paid from fraudulent financial statements, unauthorized use of a former executive's credentials to alter a former employee's personnel record, an attempted deletion of board-preserved evidence. She presented it without drama. Just the facts in order, with the documentation available for any board member who wanted to examine it. She spoke, he'd intervened. She spoke for 12 minutes. When she was done, the room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when a thing that everyone has been suspecting has finally been said out loud by someone with the authority to say it. Then she said, The board has a decision to make about leadership. Heard from Miss Sterling's team in preparation for this meeting. We'll now hear from Mr. Hale. Graham stood up. He did not have slides. He did not have a presentation. He had the notebook, and he had what he'd built through the night, and he stood at the end of the table and he talked. He talked about line 4 and what 43 units a day looks like when your quarterly report says 94% efficiency. He talked about Patricia's gray cabinets and what 4 years of kept records means when someone was supposed to be ensuring they weren't necessary. He'd be Newland. He talked about Tom Greer absorbing pressure from both directions for months, without the authority to tell anyone what was actually happening on the floor below him. He talked about the suppliers, the 8 calls from 3 in the morning, the 45 days, instead of 60, the fact that 8 out of 11 had agreed in principle to extend because, as one of them had said at 2:40 in the morning, they'd rather work with someone who calls me at 2 in the morning than someone who sends me a letter from their attorney. He talked about lines 2 and 3, the production schedule that had been running them at 62% capacity for 3 years, because a 2-day efficiency assessment had decided that was optimal, without ever asking the floor manager whether it was actually optimal. He told them that Tom Greer had those lines ready to run at full capacity from the moment the board gave authorization, and that getting those lines running was the difference between the Hansen contract being saved and lost. He talked about the 43 pages. He didn't spend long on it. He said the operational recovery methodology I'm proposing is based on a framework I developed in 2018, which was subsequently published under a different name without my knowledge or consent. The board has the documentation. I'm naming it what it is. That's not the most important thing on the table today, but it's true, and I'm done with things that are true not being on the record. He talked about the numbers. He walked through every line item of the restructuring plan, the Colton, the bonus recovery, the asset liquidation, the supplier repayment schedule, the production corrections, the executive compensation reduction. He did not use words like right-sizing or strategic restructuring or any of the other vocabulary that corporate finance uses to describe cutting things without saying that's what it's doing. He said, this is what costs too much relative to what it produces, and this is what needs to be reduced. He said it about each item in sequence, clearly and specifically. And at the end he said what it added up to, a company that could be stabilized within 90 days, that could recover its primary supplier relationships and its major production contracts within 12 months, that could do all of this without eliminating a single hourly manufacturing position. He said 17,000 employees who come to work because this company exists. The plan I'm presenting protects every one of them, because protecting them is emotionally satisfying, although it is but because they are the company. Take them away to balance a sheet, and what you have left is a balance sheet. The things that make North Star worth saving are on the factory floors, in the supplier relationships, in the institutional knowledge of people like Tom Greer, who have been absorbing the consequences of decisions they had no part in making for years, and who have been doing it without breaking. That's what you protect. Everything else is negotiable. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the board members, a man named Forsyth, who had said nothing through any of the previous presentations, looked at Graham and said, "You've been in this building for less than 48 hours. "Yes," Graham said. "And you're proposing to run a multi-billion-dollar industrial operation." "I'm proposing to stabilize it," Graham said. "Running it is a longer conversation. On what basis should this board have confidence that you can do what you're describing?" Graham looked at Forsyth. "I built the recovery framework the company has been using for 6 years. I identified the problems in this organization in 38 hours that the current management team allowed to compound for at least 4 years. I made 11 phone calls in the middle of the night to suppliers who haven't received payment in 90 days, and 8 of them agreed to give the company more time because the conversation was honest." He paused. "I'm not asking for confidence on the basis of my suit or my car or my title. I'm asking for it on the basis of what I just showed you I can do." Forsyth held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked down at the documents in front of him. Vanessa spoke then. She had been quiet through Graham's entire presentation, more quiet than anyone in the room had expected. probably more quiet than she had expected. When she spoke, her voice was controlled and exact, yet the precision back in it, the exhaustion from the previous night, folded away somewhere private. What he's described is one version of a recovery path, she said. It's aggressive in its approach to executive compensation. It makes assumptions about supplier flexibility that haven't been tested at scale, and it's being proposed by someone whose only relevant experience with a company this size was 9 years ago as a mid-level operations manager. She paused. My family built this company. I have given 12 years of my life to this company. Every contract, every facility, every relationship. What I did, the decisions I made were made under pressure that you cannot understand unless you've sat in this chair. And I made mistakes. Yes, I made serious mistakes. But destroying what my father built by handing it to someone who walked in here 48 hours ago in a 10-year-old suit is not the answer to those mistakes. The room was very quiet. Graham looked at Vanessa. She was looking at the board, not at him, and she believed what she was saying. That was the things about Vanessa Sterling that he had understood. Maybe for the first time, sitting with her in the conference room the previous night watching her father walk out. She believed in what she'd built, in her own version of it, in the story she had told herself about what she was protecting and why. The story was wrong, built on things that were false, maintained through decisions that were harmful, but she believed it gives no weight of a person who had never really been asked to believe in anything else. He did not hate her for that. He was not sure he had ever hated her. Hatred was too simple for what he felt and required too much energy that he had always needed for other things. He looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the board. The board will deliberate, she said. Thank you both. Graham stood in the hallway outside the conference room for 40 minutes while the board deliberated. He stood because sitting didn't feel right, and he couldn't pace. The hallway was too short, and he was too aware of himself, so he stood with his back against the wall and his notebook in his hands and waited. Derek came out at the 15-minute mark and stood nearby without speaking. Just stood there. Graham nodded at him, and Derek nodded back, and that was enough. At 30 minutes, the door opened and Vanessa came out. She stopped when she saw Graham. They looked at each other. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? She thought about that honestly, which surprised him. Someone angrier, she said. Someone who'd been carrying it the way I would have carried it. As a weapon. I carried other things, Graham said. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face that was complicated and private. Your wife, she said. I meant it when I said I was sorry. He said. She was. I looked her up afterward. After you left, in 2018, she sounded like someone worth knowing. He looked at the floor for a moment. She was, he said. She really was. Vanessa nodded once. Then she walked down the hallway and through the door at the far end and was gone. The door to the conference room opened at 41 minutes. Margaret stood in the doorway. She looked at Graham. Come in, she said. He came in. The board was seated. 8 faces, arranged around the table, with the accumulated weight of what they'd been doing for the last 41 minutes visible in all of them in different ways. Margaret remained standing. The board has voted, she said. Effective immediately, Vanessa Sterling is suspended as Chief Executive Officer of North Star Industrial Group, pending further review of the matters raised in the independent assessment. She paused. Derek Shaw's financial authority is suspended, pending the board's accounting review. Miles Corbett will face a separate legal process related to the evidence suppression attempt. Another pause. And Graham Hale is appointed Interim Chief Executive Officer of North Star Industrial Group, with full operational authority, effective as of this moment. The room was not silent after that. There was the sound of chairs, of papers, of the small physical adjustments people make when something significant has just settled into place. But for Graham, there was a moment, just a moment, between one breath and the next, where everything was very still. He thought about a kitchen table, about 43 pages written on nights and weekends, about a woman with a red pen asking sharp questions in the margins and a lamp that was too bright and a couch where she fell asleep while he was still working. He thought about a parking lot at 2 in the morning outside a Walgreens. He thought about Lily eating a granola bar for breakfast and leaving the light on. He picked up his notebook. All right, he said. Let's get to work. The first thing Graham did after the board meeting, was not what anyone expected. He did not go to the executive floor. He did not move into the corner office on the 42nd floor, with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of the river. He did not call a press conference or issue a company-wide memo on official letterhead with his new title printed at the bottom. He went back to the third-floor conference room, picked up his $2 notebook and his cracked briefcase, and called Tom Greer. "Mr. Hale Graham." A pause, I heard. "You heard fast. Factory floors hear everything fast. That's the one thing that actually works at full efficiency around here." A beat, and Graham could hear something in Tom's voice that wasn't quite humor, but was adjacent to it, the particular sound of a man allowing himself to breathe for the first time in a while. "What do you need?" "Lines 2 and 3, Graham said. "Are they ready?" "Been ready since 5:30 this morning." "Run them," Graham said, "full capacity. I'll have the formal authorization to you within the hour, but don't wait for the paperwork. Run them now." A pause. A real one. The kind that meant something was being felt, and the person feeling it wasn't sure how to handle that in the middle of a Thursday morning. "Yes, sir," Tom said. His voice was steady, but only just. Graham hung up and stood in the empty conference room for a moment. Through the window, the October sky had come back clean after the rain, the particular blue that only exists after a storm has moved through and taken everything unclear with it. He watched a bird cross the window frame and disappear, and thought about nothing specific for about 4 seconds, which was probably the most mental rest he was going to get for the foreseeable future. He picked up the phone again and called Derek. The next 72 hours were not a movie version of a corporate turnaround. They were not a montage of Graham striding through hallways with purpose while subordinates scrambled to keep up. They were not a series of dramatic confrontations, where he said the perfect thing and the room changed. They were grinding, unglamorous, frequently frustrating, work the kind that happens in conference rooms at 7 in the morning, and on phone calls at 11 at night, and in spreadsheets that don't balance until the third time you look at them from a different angle. Graham moved his base of operations to a mid-sized office on the 4th floor, 3 doors down from Claire Donovan's HR suite. The corner office, not the 42nd floor. The 4th floor, where the people who actually administered the company's day-to-day operations worked, where he could walk 15 steps and knock on a door, talk to a human being who knew something he needed to know. He told Margaret about the office choice on the first morning. "The 42nd floor is available," she said, in a tone that was not quite suggesting and not quite questioning. Graham said, The board will see the quarterly figures. In 90 days, Graham said. "That's what I'm focused on." Margaret looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and moved on. The first formal action Graham took as interim CEO was to request a meeting with all department heads, not a presentation, not a briefing prepared in advance, just a meeting where he sat in a room with 12 people and asked each of them the same 2 questions. What is the biggest problem in your department that you haven't been able to say out loud? And what do you need that you don't currently have? The answers took 4 hours and filled 11 pages of the notebook. Some of it he already knew. Some of it he didn't. A significant portion of it was the accumulated frustration of people who had been managing around a leadership culture that rewarded the appearance of success over its substance, and who had spent years developing workarounds for problems they weren't allowed to name. A quality control manager named Sandra, not the same Sandra who'd left the original personnel file in the archive. A different Sandra, younger, with the permanently alert expression of someone who has been catching problems that other people created, told Graham that she had flagged a materials certification issue on one of Northstar's product lines 8 months ago, and been told by Derek's office that the concern was noted and would be addressed in the next review cycle. "What review cycle?" Graham asked. Sandra looked at him. "Exactly," she said. He added it to the notebook. After the department head meeting, he sent an email to all 17,000 Northstar employees. A press release. Not a corporate communication vetted by 6 attorneys. An email written in plain language from his actual email address that said, "My name is Graham Hale. I've been appointed interim CEO, and I want to be honest with you about where we are." He described the situation in terms that were real, without being panic-inducing. Said, "Sequin, He said the company had serious problems that had been allowed to develop over several years, that the board was addressing them directly, and that his primary commitment as interim CEO was to protect the jobs of the people who kept North Star's operations running. He said, if you see something wrong, I want to hear about it. He included his direct email address. He received 412 responses in the first 24 hours. He did not read all of them. Personally, he was one person, and 412 emails was a volume problem. But he read the first 120 before handing the inbox to a small team. He assembled from HR and operations to triage and respond. From those 120, he identified 9 issues that needed immediate attention and 3 that had potential legal implications. Claire Donovan ran the HR triage team. She did it with the precision and commitment of a person who had been waiting for years for someone to give her permission to actually do her job. You don't have to do all of this. Personally, she said to him on the second morning, when she found him in his floor office at 6:45 a.m., reading through a stack of printed emails. Graham said, "So why? Because if I stop reading them," he said, "they become data, and I need them to stay people." He paused. "Does that make sense?" Claire looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Actually, it does." She went to make coffee, and Graham kept reading. The supplier renegotiations took the better part of the first 2 weeks. The 8 suppliers who had agreed in principle during Graham's 3 a.m. phone calls were relatively straightforward. They wanted the repayment schedule in writing, the board's signature on the commitment letter, and a point of contact they could actually reach when they called. Graham gave them all 3. He also gave each of them a direct line to Derek, who stripped of his financial authority but retained an advisory capacity at Graham's specific request. For several board members' objections turned out to be exceptionally useful when his job was supporting a recovery, rather than obscuring a problem. Derek was not a dishonest man by nature. Graham had understood this partway through their conversation in the cafeteria, and the subsequent 72 hours had confirmed it. Derek was a man who had made a series of bad decisions under pressure from someone who held power over his livelihood, each decision making the next one harder to walk back from, until he was so far into the architecture of the problem that he'd lost his ability to see it from the outside. That was a human failure, not a moral one. Or rather, it was a moral failure that was also deeply recognizably human, the kind that Graham had seen in the mirror enough times to know he wasn't entitled to stand in judgment of it. He told Derek this directly, in the small office on the 4th floor, on the 3rd day. Derek looked at him across the desk. "Why are you keeping me on?" "Because you know where everything is," Graham said. "And because you kept the drive." The drive was self-protection, but kept you for 8 months without using it as leverage. That tells me something. Graham picked up his pen. "Make me wrong about you." Derek was quiet for a moment. "The 3 suppliers who didn't agree," he said. "Carlisle Industrial is the one that matters. They supply the primary binding components for lines 1 through 3 at Site 7. If Carlisle files formal breach, it doesn't just affect the Hansen contract, it affects everything downstream." Graham said, "I'm going to Carlisle." Going, Derek stopped. In person? In person. Graham, the CEO of Carlisle, he's not someone who responds to crap. Everybody responds to somebody showing up, Graham said. "Send me the address." He drove to Carlisle Industrial's regional office the following morning, again without a driver, again with the radio off. The CEO's name was Frank Novak, 63 years old, family-owned operation, 2nd generation, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent 40 years watching larger companies treat smaller ones like expenses on a ledger. The meeting was not easy. Frank Novak had not built his company by being charmed in conference rooms, and he had no particular interest in being charmed now. He was short and broad and wore a company polo shirt to a meeting with a Fortune 500 interim CEO, which Graham respected. He had a framed photo on his desk of a factory floor, not a golf course, which Graham also respected. The first 20 minutes of the conversation were uncomfortable. Frank laid out Carlisle's position with the directness of someone who had stopped softening bad news sometime in the previous decade. 94 days past due, a principal balance of $4.3 million, 2 prior repayment commitments that had not been honored, and a legal team that was ready to file by end of month. Graham did not argue with any of it. He acknowledged each point specifically, without hedging. He explained what had happened at North Star, not the corporate version, the real version, and he watched Frank Novak's face as he did it. "You're telling me," Frank said, when Graham had finished, "that the invoices we sent for $4.3 million sat in an accounts payable queue while we're doctoring production numbers and paying themselves bonuses." "Yes," Graham said. Frank leaned back in his chair and looked at Graham for a long moment. "You got some nerve coming here," he said. "I know. You weren't there when it happened. But I'm here now." Frank tapped 2 fingers on his desk. "The repayment schedule you're proposing. 12 months. First payment within 30 days. I'll put board collateral behind the commitment." "Board collateral means something to you," Frank said. "To me, it means another piece of paper." Graham looked at him. "What would mean something to you?" Frank tapped his desk again. "That photo," he said, nodding toward the frame. "That's our main facility. 432 people. I make payroll 42 times a year, and I haven't missed one in 23 years. He looked at Graham. "What keeps me up at night? Not the receivables, the payroll, because those are my people, and they showed up because they trusted me." "That feeling," Graham said. Frank studied him. "Do you? I have a plant manager at Site 7 who kept a broken production line running with half the parts he needed because he was afraid that reporting the truth would cost his 300 workers their jobs." Graham paused. "And he was probably right. Until this week." Silence. Frank picked up a pen and looked at the repayment proposal on the table. 30 days to first payment, he said. "Not 30 business days. 30 calendar days." "Done," Graham said. "And I want a standing monthly call. Personally. Not your finance team. You." "Done." Frank signed the agreement. He walked Graham to the door himself, which Frank Novak almost certainly did not do for most people. "What's your problem's going to be?" Frank said. At the door. "What's that?" "You're honest." Frank said it flatly, as a statement of fact, with no particular warmth. "Honest people in that business tend to have a short shelf life." Graham said, "I'm working on making that a structural problem rather than a personal one." Frank looked at him for a moment. Then he stuck out his hand. Graham shook it. He drove back with the radio still off and the signed agreement on the passenger seat, and he thought about what Frank Novak had said. The skepticism of it that he'd heard before and would hear again. But the specific thing underneath it, the thing Frank was actually describing, a world in which honesty is the anomaly, in which the person who shows up and tells the truth is notable for doing so, in which that quality is understood to be fragile and situational rather than structural. He thought about what it would take to make it structural, to build it into the organization, not as a value statement on a wall, but as an actual operating principle, with actual consequences when violated and actual protections when practiced. He thought about that for the whole drive back. Whistleblower protection policy went through the board in the 3rd week. It was not a complicated document. Graham had written the first draft himself on a Thursday evening in his 4th floor office in about 90 minutes. It said, in plain language, any North Star employee who reports a genuine concern about illegal, unethical, or unsafe practices through the designated channel will be protected from retaliation. Period. Not subject to the manager's discretion. Not contingent on the concern being validated before protection applies. Protected from the moment of reporting. 3 board members wanted to add qualifications. Graham pushed back on everyone. "The qualifications are how you get around it," he said in the board review meeting. Every corporate policy that was supposed to protect whistleblowers, and didn't every single one, had qualifications. The qualifications are the gap that retaliation fits through. Forsyth, the board member who had questioned Graham's competence in the first meeting, looked up from the document. "You're describing a policy that could be exploited by bad faith reporters." "Yeah," Graham said. "Some people will misuse it. That's the cost." He looked around the table. "The alternative cost is what you saw in the last 2 weeks of documents. Employees who knew something was wrong and couldn't say it. That cost more." The policy passed 4-1 with 3 abstentions. Graham considered that a win. The hiring policy change took longer and was harder. North Star's existing hiring framework, like most large corporations of its age and structure, contained layers of implicit filtering that had nothing to do with the ability to do the job. Educational pedigree requirements that screened out qualified candidates from state schools, address-based background parameters that correlated closely with income levels, even in a dress code requirement for interviews that specified professional business attire without any provision for candidates who might not own it. Graham replaced all of it. What he replaced it with was simpler. The requirements for any position were the skills and experience the job actually needed. Nothing else. No pedigree requirements beyond what the role genuinely required. Implicit filters. Interview dress code changed to wear what you have. The HR team would conduct training on the specific bias patterns that had embedded themselves in their standard processes, the tendency to evaluate confidence rather than competence, to read social fluency as intelligence, to mistake familiarity with prestige markers for capability. Claire Donovan ran the training herself. She told Graham afterward that the most common response from HR team had been some version of, "I didn't realize I was doing that." "What did you tell them?" Graham asked. "I told them that's exactly the problem," Claire said. "And also that knowing it is the beginning of not doing it." Graham thought about that for a while. He also thought about the reception desk on the 42nd floor, about the young woman behind the $12,000 desk who had looked at his shoes and done the fast scan, the assessment that happened in a half second and set the social register for everything that followed. He didn't blame her. She'd been operating exactly as the culture had trained her to operate. But he thought about every person who had walked through that lobby and been sized up before they said a word. No, and about how many of those people had been right about things that the polished ones above him had been wrong about. He wrote a note in his notebook. "The lobby is a message. Make sure it's the right one." He didn't know exactly what that looked like yet. Kept it in the notebook, which was where things went when he needed to solve them slowly. Vanessa left the building on a Friday morning 3 weeks after the board vote. Graham was not present for it, by design. He had a supplier call at 8 and a department review at 9:30, and he had not arranged his schedule around Vanessa's departure because that felt like the wrong kind of attention to pay to it. But he knew it was happening because Margaret had told him the night before, briefly and without elaboration, "Vanessa's coming in tomorrow morning to collect her personal items from the 42nd floor." He thought about it during the supplier call, tried to identify what he felt about it, and found, as he often did when he looked directly at the Vanessa question, that the answer was more complicated and less satisfying than a cleaner emotion would have been. He didn't feel triumphant. He had expected, maybe, to feel something like vindication, the particular satisfaction of having been proven right about something that had cost you enormously. But vindication required the wound to close when the proof arrived. And the wound was 8 years old and had been kept open, not by Vanessa specifically, but by everything that had grown in its wake. The years of rebuilding, the grief, the kitchen table, and the $2 notebook, and the way Lily had learned to ask if he was okay, by asking if he was going to be okay, because the direct version was too much for a 16-year-old to carry. What he felt, if he was honest, was tired, and under the tired something smaller and more private. Something that was not peace exactly, but was in the direction of peace. The feeling of having done what you set out to do, and knowing that you did it the way you needed to do it. He was told later, by the security supervisor, that when Vanessa walked through the lobby on her way out, none of the employees who were present laughed at her. Several looked up. Most looked back down. One nodded. She walked out through the glass doors, and the doors closed behind her. The supervisor told Graham this in a factual tone, without editorializing. Graham thanked him and went back to his department review. There was no dramatic moment in it. There was no scene. Just a woman walking through a lobby, and a door closing, and everyone getting back to work. That was probably the right way for it to end. 91 days after Graham Hale was appointed interim CEO, North Star Industrial Group avoided default. It was not a clean 90 days. There was a week in the middle where the Carlyle payment almost didn't go through because of a processing error in the Treasury system that nobody caught until 36 hours before the deadline. And Graham spent those 36 hours on the phone with bank and the board, and Frank Novak personally, who was not warm about it, but was ultimately willing to wait. There was a period in the second month where two board members began pushing, quietly and through back channels, for a more conventional replacement CEO, someone with a longer executive track record, a more recognizable name, a more legible biography. Margaret handled that, and Graham was never entirely sure how, but she handled it. Lines 2 and 3 ran at full capacity for 11 straight weeks. The Hansen contract was renegotiated, not lost, renegotiated by 3 weeks in the delivery timeline, which the Hansen people accepted with the particular relief of a client who had been expecting to hear something much worse. Line 4 came back online in the 7th week. The drive assembly parts finally arrived, and 3 of them failed immediately as they had done before, because the problem was not the parts but the installation protocol that nobody had updated, since the machine was modified 4 years prior. Tom Greer figured that out on a Tuesday afternoon by reading the original manufacturer's technical manual, which had been sitting in a filing cabinet in the maintenance office the entire time. Tom told Graham this story over the phone with the combination of exasperation and satisfaction that belongs to Puseby, yet to people who have spent years watching problems persist that didn't need to. So the manual had the answer, Graham said. The manual had the answer, Tom confirmed. How long had the manual been there? A pause. The filing date on the binder says 2019. 4 years. 4 years. Graham said nothing for a moment. Sometimes the thing you needed most had been present and unread for 4 years, and you couldn't do anything with that fact except make sure it didn't stay unread any longer. Get it running, he said. Already running, Tom said. Has been since Tuesday. By the end of the 3rd month, 12 of the 14 suppliers who had been in default status were current on their new payment schedules. The other 2 were on agreed extension plans with no breach filings. Yet the executive bonus recovery process had returned $6.1 million to the company's operating accounts, pending the outcome of Miles Corbett's separate legal proceeding, which was ongoing, and which Graham had no involvement in beyond what the board required. The corporate jet sold at auction for $2.9 million, slightly below what Derek had estimated, because the market for corporate jets is not a seller's market when the seller is a company in financial recovery, and everyone knows it. Graham signed the transfer documents himself and did not feel any particular way about it. It was a jet. The company needed the $2.9 million more than it needed the jet. The Manhattan apartment took longer but eventually sold. The Georgetown townhouse, the one buried in the subsidiary ledger that most of the board hadn't known about, was the last to go, because the legal untangling of the subsidiary structure required more time than Graham had initially budgeted for. It closed in the 4th month, and the net from all 4 properties, combined with the fleet vehicle liquidation and the bonus recovery, created enough operational breathing room that the company's primary creditors reduced their watch list classification from critical to monitored. The board voted at the end of the 4th month to make the appointment permanent. The vote was 6-2. Graham did not ask who the 2 were. It didn't matter. Margaret called him with the result. He was in his car in the parking garage, about to drive home, and he sat with the phone against his ear and listened to her say the words, and then sat for a moment after she'd finished. Graham, she said, you should be pleased about this. I am, he said. I'm also thinking about what it means in terms of what I have to do next. A pause. You're impossible, she said, with something that was not quite affection but was close. I've been told, he said. He drove home, the same route he'd been driving for 4 months, through the same neighborhoods, past the same landmarks. He pulled into the driveway of the small rented house he still shared with Lily. He had not moved, had not upgraded, had not done any of the things that the newly permanent CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company might be expected to do, and he sat in the car for a moment listening to the engine tick as it cooled. He could afford a different house now. He could afford quite a few different things now. He thought about that in a general way, without urgency, the way you think about things that are available to you, but don't need to be decided tonight. The light was on inside. He got out of the car and went in. Yet, he meaned. Lily was at the kitchen table, which was where she did her homework, which was where he'd done his own best thinking for as long as he could remember. She had 3 textbooks open, and a laptop and a mug of something hot, and she looked up when he came in with the expression she'd had, since she was about 4 years old when he came home, a brief, genuine brightness that she was old enough now to half conceal with casualness, but not quite old enough to fully hide. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he set the briefcase down, took off his jacket. "You eat? I made pasta. Real pasta or just noodles with butter. It's pasta with a sauce I made from actual ingredients." He looked at her. "What ingredients? Canned tomatoes, garlic, and olive oil." She paused. "Salt. That's actually a sauce," he said, surprised. "How to cook, Dad?" "I've been cooking for 6 years." "You've been eating cereal and granola bars for 6 years." "That's also cooking. Differently." She tilted her head. "How'd it go?" "The board thing?" He sat down at the table across from her, the kitchen table. The same table, the one that had witnessed more of his actual life than any other piece of furniture he'd ever owned. He thought about 43 pages written at this table, or one like it, red pen in the margins, about a lamp that was too bright. "They made it permanent," he said. Lily looked at him for a moment. "Couldn't meet." Her expression did several things in quick succession that she couldn't quite control surprise, though she'd been expecting it, because expecting something and having it happen are always different. Something intervened. Then something that looked like relief. Then something that was clearly pride and that she assembled back into casualness before it could fully surface. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "I mean, yeah, obviously. It was always going to be permanent." She looked back at her textbook. "I could have told you that. Could you? You had the right answer. You just needed them to see it." She turned a page. "That's how it works, right? You do the work and eventually the right people see it." He looked at her. She was 16 years old, and she was right. And she was also not entirely right, because the world did not reliably reward people who did the work and had the right answer, and she would learn that in her own time and in her own specific ways, there was nothing he could do to protect her from that learning, except try to give her something solid enough to stand on when it happened. But she was not wrong about tonight. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." She looked up at him. Not at his face exactly, at the notebook in his jacket pocket, which was sticking out slightly. "You brought that home again." "I always bring it home." "You're going to work tonight, aren't you?" "Probably," he said. "After dinner." She shook her head in the way she shook her head at him, which was not annoyed but was something that contained affection inside, an expression of mild exasperation, the same expression her mother had used, the same angle to the head, the same set to the mouth, and every time he saw it, he felt the loss of Ellen as a clean and specific pain that he had come to understand was not going to go away, and that he had also come to understand was not supposed to go away. "There's pasta on the stove," Lily said. "Serve yourself." He served himself. It was genuinely a sauce, simple, a little undersalted, but real. He told her it was good. She said she knew. They ate at the kitchen table, and she told him about the chemical bonding unit, which had evolved into something about molecular structures that she was finding genuinely interesting. And he listened and asked questions, some of which were real questions, and some of which were the questions you ask to keep a person talking, because you like listening to them think. And she answered all of them with the directness she had always had and that he had always loved. After dinner, he washed the dishes. Old habit. He'd been washing dishes in this kitchen for 2 years, and he did it automatically, the way you do things you've done. No, enough times that your hands know the sequence without the brain needing to participate. Lily had gone back to her textbooks. Outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood was doing its evening things, a dog being walked, somebody's porch light coming on, the distant sound of a television through a neighbor's window. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a Thursday. He dried his hands and took his jacket off the hook by the door and reached into the pocket for the notebook, and his hand found instead what was also inside the pocket, the new identification badge that the building's security team had issued him that morning. Standard North Star ID. His photo, which he had not posed for graciously. His name in the font they used for everyone. No special treatment. Graham Hale, Chief Executive Officer. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about the lobby on the 42nd floor. Navy carpet and $12,000 desks, and the fast scan that happens in a half second and sets everything that follows. He thought about a sealed envelope on a conference table and a voice that said he hadn't come to ask for a job. Yet, he thought about Patricia's gray cabinets and Claire's steady hands and Tom Greer on the phone at 2:15 in the morning, saying been ready since 5:30. He thought about Frank Novak in a company polo shirt and the framed photo of a factory floor and 43 years of making payroll without missing once. He thought about what it had cost to get here. Not in money. Money was the simple version of the cost, the one you could write on a piece of paper and show people. The other kind. The years of rebuilding something from nothing. The hours in hospital waiting rooms. The parking lot outside the Walgreens. Yes, he'd intervened. The morning he had to explain to a 13-year-old that the world had taken something from her, that it had no right to take, and that she was going to have to keep going anyway, and that he was going to be there, and that those two things were the truest things he knew how to say. He put the badge back in his pocket. The morning after the board made the appointment permanent, Graham Hale could have walked into North Star wearing anything. He had the salary now, the authority, the title on the badge. He could have walked in wearing exactly what a CEO of a company that size was supposed to wear: the suit that costs, the shoes that had never seen a concrete driveway at 3 in the morning. He put on the same shoes. He stood in the kitchen, in the small rented house he still shared with his daughter, and he put on the same shoes, and he looked at the scratches on the left toe from the archive cabinet door and the older scuffs from years before that, from the years of carrying things that needed to be carried, and he thought, these are honest shoes. They tell the truth about where you've been, and the truth about where you've been is the only thing that earns you the right to say anything about where you're going. He had not become a different person. That was the thing he most wanted to be true, and checking it against the evidence of the last 4 months, the notebook, the 4 in the morning supplier calls, the 4th floor office, pasta that his daughter made from actual ingredients, he thought it was still true. He picked up his briefcase, still cracked at the corner. He had not replaced it. Lily was in the hallway, backpack on, hair not quite as organized as it had been when she went to bed, eating a granola bar. He looked at her. "There's actual food in the kitchen," he said. "This is food," she said, "and I'm late." "Lily." "Dad." She looked at him, looked at the shoes, looked not up at his face, looked back up at expression that was not quite the same as the expression she was developing, and not quite the same as the child expression she was leaving behind. Something's in the space between. "You're wearing the old shoes," he said. She looked at them for another moment. Then she looked at him. "Good," she said. She went out the door. He heard her footsteps on the porch, down the 3 steps to the driveway, and then the sound of the street receiving her. The ordinary Thursday morning sounds taking her in. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then Graham Hale, the 32-year-old widowed single father who had walked into North Star Industrial Group's headquarters 3 months ago, in an aging suit and scuffed shoes and a cracked briefcase, the man a billionaire had looked at and seen nothing worth respecting, picked up his notebook and his briefcase, and walked out into the morning, to prove he belonged there, not to show anyone what he'd become, just to do the work that needed doing, in the shoes that told the truth about who he was enough. It had always been enough. He just hadn't always had the room to prove it.